Good morning. How are you? Good? Bit early in the morning. It's good to see that you came. And my name is Guillaume. I'm the general manager at Global Citizen. And it's a pleasure for me to be here at ChangeNOW among people who care deeply about where the world is going. But to be honest, I think we all know where we want to go, and the real challenge is not to define the future we want. It's deciding what we prioritize when things are getting difficult. And right now, things are getting pretty difficult. Public budgets are tightening, and companies are under pressure. Geopolitical tensions are rising. And in moments like this, something very predictable happens. We focus on what feels essential, and everything else starts to look, optional, right? So too often, inclusion ends up in that second category. It's important, yes, people will tell you it's important, but it's not urgent. Something we can come back to later. But yet, if inclusion is one of the first things that we cut when times get tough, it's also one of the last things we actually can afford to lose. So let me start with a simple question. What do we actually mean when we say inclusion? Because today the term has become complicated, right? For some, it's about diversity, representation. For others, it's about social justice. And increasingly, especially on the other side of the Atlantic, it has become politicized, right? We see companies stepping back from DEI commitments. We see language being softened, some of the topics quietly put under the carpet, priorities quietly shifting. So there's, I think, an elephant in the room. Inclusion is being questioned at exactly the moment when we need it most. So let me offer a very simple definition. It's worth what it's worth, but inclusion, I think, is about three things. One, who gets access to opportunity? Two, who has a voice in shaping decisions? And three, who shares the benefits? Rather than just the costs, who gets to share the benefits of economic change? So inclusion is not about optics. It's about who gets access, who gets a voice, who shares in the outcome. And once you define it that way, then the conversation changes. Because inclusion is no longer a side issue, it becomes a question of how well our economies actually function. Because when people are excluded from tools, from education, from jobs, economies actually underperform. So if people cannot participate, economies do not perform. And when exclusion scales, then it creates something else. It creates distrust, it creates disengagement, it creates instability. And today, 1 in 5 people globally feel like no one is in their corner. I want you to reflect on that. 1 in 5 people globally feel like no one is in their corner. That's terrible, right? I mean, look at ourselves, 1 in 5 people feel like no one is in their corner. So exclusion does not just leave people behind, it actually pulls the system apart. So at Global Citizen, and for those of you who do not know us well, we work to end extreme poverty by mobilizing citizens and governments and businesses to take action. And we see this, this dynamic everywhere, right? Inclusion is often framed as the right thing to do, but what we see again and again is that it's actually the smart thing to do. So, inclusion is not just a social policy, it's a performance strategy. That's what it is. Because inclusion drives participation, participation drives productivity, and productivity will drive growth. And I know this kind of sounds a little bit theoretical, so what does it mean in practice? Inclusion is not abstract. It shows up in very practical ways. So if you take access to assistive technology, for instance, what are we talking about there? Billions of people today lack the basic tools, hearing aids, mobility devices, glasses, that allow them to learn, to work, to participate in society. Without these tools, people are not less capable. Without these tools, they're just excluded from education, from jobs, from the economy. If I take this off, I could be in any room. I don't even know if you're there. And I could be speaking to an empty row of seats. It's incredible the power of assistive devices just to bring people back into education, jobs, all the things I could do simply because of that tool. But of course, this is not what everybody gets access to, and that's why we're working at Global Citizen with AT-Scale, a global partnership that brings together governments, companies, philanthropies to make assistive technology accessible to all. I'm very glad that my friend Leopoldine is here today. Hi, Leopoldine. She's amazing. She's been an inspiration for me and for all of us. She's a champion, an advocate, an ambassador for inclusion and for AT-Scale. So thank you very much for doing this together. Because that's what inclusion looks like in practice. You know, it's not a concept. It's a system that enables participation. But besides being a tool, inclusion is also access to participation itself. Because you may have the tools, you may have the glasses, you may have the assistive technologies, you may not be allowed to participate in the life of the city. And that's, of course, outrageous. And so we should do everything we can to make sure people are allowed to participate, whoever they are. But perhaps equally surprising and worrying is that sometimes you have the tool, you're allowed to participate, and yet you don't want to participate because you don't feel that your voice matters. And this to us at Global Citizen is extremely worrying because it's not only exclusion from the economy, it's disengagement from society. A sense that your voice doesn't matter, that participation doesn't change outcomes. And so we work with a community with 12.5 million people, citizens, global citizens around the world, because we want to fight apathy. We are telling people, do things, engage, go to your local civil society organization, your NGO, your community, your local church, whatever rocks your boat, but do not stay idle. And so that's really an important part of inclusion, because when people disengage, systems weaken. And so if we step back, the pattern is very simple, right? Inclusion is not about being nice, it's about making systems work, who participates, who contributes, who trusts the system, and ultimately, whether that system is stable. Now, let me make things slightly more complicated. There's another word that has become just as difficult as inclusion. And that word is a C word, is a very polemical, apparently, C word. Some might say a dirty word. You know that C word, right? It's climate. Climate has become an incredibly difficult conversation to be had, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic, but pretty much it's creeping, just like inclusion, as part of the vocabulary that we cannot use or we shouldn't use. But the reality is simple. The greening of the economy is happening, and climate and inclusion, in my view, need to click together. Now, bear with me with that for a second. If you look at what happened in the past 12 to 18 months, take China, for instance. 16 million new electric vehicles were produced just last year in China. That's a 28% increase. 91% of all energy projects on the planet that were built in the past 2 years are actually more profitable than any of their equivalent in fossil fuel-based energy. So it's pretty clear that the economic case for climate is there and is increasingly there. And of course, the environmental case for climate is also there. So then you might think, well, then it's going to happen. Why can it potentially not happen? And I think the answer to that question, to that conundrum that should preoccupy us all, is inclusion. Because the question becomes not so much, you know, are you going to make money out of greening the energy sector? The answer is yes. Is it good for us? The answer is yes. But the question is, when you're greening the economy, who is it for? Who gets the jobs? Who gets access to affordable energy? Who captures the value? And who pays the price? And so, when you look at this kind of, I think that's been coined green backlash, right? That we've seen in some places around the world in the past 12 to 24 months, it boils down to citizens feeling that, yes, of course they care about the environment, but what's in it for them? Are they losing out? It's folks who are coal miners in South Africa, and they say, yeah, of course I'd like the environment to be better, but am I going to lose my job? It's folks like farmers. It's folks everywhere, in fact, around the world that feel about the environment in an ambivalent fashion because they care about it, but they feel I'm not part of this debate. I want to be part of this debate. And so we will see, if we don't pair inclusion and climate, we will see resistance, we will see backlash, we will see a slowdown, and potentially, if people don't see themselves in this transition, they will stand in the way. But if it's inclusive, it becomes investable, it becomes scalable, it becomes durable. That's why I think the next phase of global climate action matters so much, and it will be about bringing climate and inclusion together. So there's COP31, as you know, at the end of this year, under the presidency of Turkey and Australia, and that follows what happened last year in Brazil. COP31 is really high stakes, from basically moving from theoretical targets to actual, real economic transformation. And so the real question there will be not so much how much ambition do we have, but what kind of transition are we building? So that's why in the lead-up of COP31, we will be convening at Global Citizen one of our summits called Global Citizen Now in Perth, Australia. This is a platform that will bring together leaders across governments, businesses, finance, and civil society, not just to talk, but to drive concrete commitments where we bring climate and inclusion together. Discuss energy, critical minerals, heavy industry, global demand. The transition will not be one in concept. It will be one in places where industry, capital, and people actually met. And so the question we want to put on this table is simple. Can we build a green economy that is inclusive? Because if we can, we will unlock capital, we will unlock political support, we'll accelerate the transition. But if we can't, we will create inequality, resistance, and slow everything down. See, so inclusion and climate, I think that's our next frontier. But let me close with this. Inclusion is not a separate agenda. It's the condition for everything else to work. It's the condition for people to have a voice and to feel part of a city. It is the condition for economies to grow. It is the conditions for society to remain stable. And it is a condition, I believe, for the climate transition to succeed. It's not about optics, it's not about language, it's not about ideology. It's not about ideology. It's about outcomes. Who gets to participate, who gets left out, and what kind of future that creates. So let me finish with this. Inclusion is not only the right thing to do. Inclusion is the only way this works. Thank you very much.